to Studio with your local lay Dominicans. We'll be discussing some of the gems we've discovered in our studium, where we share the fruits of our contemplation and the joy of the gospel message. Representing our St. Albert the Great lay Dominican chapter and co-host of today's show are myself, Cheryl Drozda,
Jeff Drozda,
Michael Totaro.
And we're back today. Mike had this great suggestion to cover the constitutions that came out of the Vatican II, the Second Vatican Council. And so we are on to one of the largest ones,
The largest.
Yeah, the largest one, I believe 32,000 words long, and who's counting? And it is known as Gaudium et Spes, even though the original title was supposed to be Gaudium et Luctus Spes et Angor, which would have been joy and grief, hope and anxiety. When they changed it, they changed the sentence to the joy and hope, grief and anxiety. It also kind of left us with that two-word title, Gaudium et Spes, which is joy and hope. The unfortunate part of this is that it leaves out sort of a balance that is, I think, created throughout the document, a balance of, the temporal and the spiritual, a balance of so many things. And so that was just an interesting piece of information that I found in the research that I thought, wow, I'm gonna have to let people know about that, because I do appreciate sort of the balance we get. And by the way, this is known as the Pastoral Constitution on the Church in the Modern World. It's the longer title there.
Yes, in fact, Gaudium et Spes stands apart from the other major council documents as a pastoral constitution rather than a dogmatic constitution. So basically, its primary concern is not a particular doctrine of the church, but rather the care of souls. So it's intended to guide the church in her mission of evangelization and salvation.
And so many people think it's a call to action, and there is a lot of action items. There are a lot of action items in the document. But I would like to, even though there's so much to cover, and sometimes you kind of wait for those great big moments, but I don't think we have much time because there's so many big things in this document. I wanted to bring up Brother Philip Murray's a friar in the Order of Preachers, and I heard him talk about this, and he was saying that it's like he likened it to what St. Hildegard called a symphony of the blessed. So by cultivating ourselves, we can, by cultivating each of us individually to a call of excellence, we can all have this sort of joyful musical role to play all together. But it's still that call of contemplation that we need to actually look at, even though it seems like a call to action. What do you think?
Yeah, and in fact, what's in doing some background research, preparing for our program today, turns out that one of the chief architects of this document, Gaudium et Spes, was Cardinal Karol Wojtyła, whom we now know as St. John Paul II, John Paul the Great. And basically, it really does read quite a bit like his encyclicals, and they focus. This document focuses on many of the same themes that we saw, with his writings and encyclicals and other documents, which would include like the dignity of the human person, the sanctity of marriage, the right to property. And again, to reiterate, this particular document is the longest of the four major council documents, and it just covers a whole plethora of topics.
Yeah, and looking at the background just for a quick second, is that it's clear that whenever you see something that comes out, something like this, you look at Vatican II, you always want to look at well, what led up to that? And it's clear that the world was in turmoil leading up to it. You had World War II, you had the atrocities that took place, like the Holocaust. You had a great deal of international issues taking place. And so the church and obviously Pope John the 23rd, realized that now was the time for the church to be maybe a little bit more proactive as opposed to reactive. If we're going to compare Vatican I, Vatican II, they're very different. But it's clear this call to action that you mentioned, Cheryl, and Mike. This is something which led up to that, and I think this was in the forefront of a lot of cardinals' minds, especially Pope John Paul II, who was unfortunately intimately involved in the atrocities and as in experiencing the atrocities of World War II. Yes,
it's. I'm glad you sort of made those points, Jeff, because we do have to consider what was taking place in the world at that time, and of course it didn't just happen overnight. In fact, the church's defenses, had been sort of on high alert since the Protestant Reformation, and so from that point forward, it had seemed as if everything was kind of falling apart, as if the whole infrastructure of Christendom was under attack. And so this document represents a true shift in the Church's posture toward the world. So before Vatican II, the Church's general attitude towards secular society was, for the most part, isolationist and critical.
And I know we're going to be jumping around a bit in this document, but just to let the listeners know a little bit more about the structure, there are two parts. The first part is the Church and man's calling, and there are 4 chapters under that. And then the second part is some problems of special urgency, and there are 5 chapters underneath that they all go into, we'll probably go into some of those individual topics, but just to kind of give sort of a framework to everyone, that's sort of the setup of this document.
Yes, and in fact, so I'm glad you sort of established that sort of a framework, because the sort of objective, the underlying objective that the Council Fathers really had in mind for this document was to produce a document that represents the Church's never-ending quest to evangelize culture. And so basically, if we can refer to Matthew chapter 16, verse 3, judge the signs of the times. Okay, and so this document sort of gives the ability to the Church to do exactly that. And so there's this sort of misconception that we hear quite often, I think, that the Church is out of touch or ignorant about what is going on in the world. But reading this document certainly debunks that idea.
Definitely, and I think that we'd mentioned Pope St. John Paul the Great, and he's the one that did give the moniker to it, the Pastoral Constitution. That's I thought that was kind of interesting.
Yes.
I mean, he's such a fatherly figure and such a good pastor. I believe this is something that was close to his heart. And one way to look at, I think, the purpose and intent is just to look at the very opening statement, and I'll just read that. The joy and hope, grief and anxiety of the men of this time, especially those who are poor or in any way afflicted, are also the joy and hope, grief and anxiety of the disciples of Christ. And so, I mean, as we're in this time of the Eucharist, we can, by way of that unity of the Eucharist, we can unite our lives to the sacrifice of the cross and offer this up to all of humanity, to everyone. And this is a way that we can, when I'm going to talk about those calls to action, also contemplation, right?
Yes. What you've just said, those opening words, basically illustrates that the Church is not just a spectator in the world. So when society suffers, so too does the Church. And so the Church, recognizes that there, of course, wants to teach the world that there is objective truth. And in fact, Gaudium et Spes begins by asking a basic question: what is the situation of humanity in the world today? And in general, the by way of the document, the Council answers from paragraph 9. I'll quote it. Man is growing in awareness that the forces he has unleashed are in his own hands, and that it is up to him to control them or be enslaved by them. And here lies the modern dilemma, end quote. And so this sets the tone for the centerpiece of our faith, Jesus Christ, who is the center of civilization.
And Mike, you were saying it addresses what the situation in the world is, and the situation we have some issues. We actually did the show on Pelagianism and the heresy of thinking that man can do everything on his own. We didn't need the grace of God. And I feel like this is a rebuttal against Pelagianism. I mean, some people say it's not, but there are several places in here where I thought it refuted Pelagianism, and that's one of them. It definitely does not put man at the top. It puts God at the top of all of this. And basically, in paragraph number 4, it says, finally, man painstakingly searches for a better world without a corresponding spiritual advancement, which is what Gaudium et Spes is trying to lead people into. That, again, the contemplation, this, for us to be a part of this, because we are united in this brotherhood. Again, that concept that I hear frequently from the saints, we are forgetting that we belong to each other and we need to help each other, right? But this idea that we're searching for a better world, but we can't do it on our own. And I think we had this discussion in our studium that we were talking about people these days are clamoring for peace. And we were talking about how that clamoring is that activity that they're trying to do it, and it's not going to get anywhere. We've seen it before. By ourselves, just man's effort alone, there is no utopia.
Exactly. And, so we have to remember that we are made in the image and likeness of God, and every human being is created by God for the purpose of dwelling in communion with Him. But, so as you've just been articulating, the modern world flips this notion on its head. Basically, there is no God, or if there is a God, it's just simply one thing among others in the universe, and the world is an accident source in some mathematical probability, and humanity is the animal lucky enough to be able to decode equations and all these kinds of things, and so there is no aspect of our existence that is for the higher good, but rather we turn inward, upon ourselves, and it becomes I instead of thou and others.
So one thing I wanted to share is that I was looking, as I was reading through Gaudium et Spes, I was looking up some commentary on an area that I had some questions about, and I found a commentary by Daniel J. Castellano, and I'm not even sure who this person is, but I do feel like he has an excellent insight to what the real intent of this was, and definitely an insight into the Latin translation, which is sometimes a little bit muddled. In our more common and accessible versions, there are a couple of minor mistakes and they slightly misrepresent what they're trying to say. So he actually gives a transliteral part where it is confusing, and it's very little, minor, but it can help a lot to look at that and get that clarified. But one statement he makes I thought was a really great statement on religion in general. He says, a more rationalistic, anti-superstitious mentality has the upside of purifying religion among believers, but also the downside of causing religion itself to be discarded as superstition, even by the common man, rather than just a few intellectuals. Now, that's quite a statement, but I wonder if you could help me unpack that a little bit.
Well, I again, just sort of taking that as kind of a point of departure in our conversation, and that, so when we talk about dismissing this notion of God and spirituality, why? Well, Gaudium et Spes makes clear that the modern world prioritizes bodily satisfaction. and ignores spiritual development altogether. And so I'll quote, this is section 10 or paragraph 10, "The dichotomy affecting the modern world is, in fact, a symptom of the deeper dichotomy that is in man himself," end quote. And so the problem is, according to the Council Fathers, is the vast majority of people around the world are not attending to their spiritual needs. They run about chasing every whim, every fad, every pleasure, but they arrive home empty every night.
And that goes back to contemplation. I really feel like, we've been talking about contemplation a lot in our studium. And I mean, I feel like that's an answer for all of us. We really need to turn, I'm saying this to myself as well, just turn more to contemplation.
Exactly. Oh, St. Augustine, right?
Yeah.
Our hearts are restless
until
they rest in Thee, O God.
You're listening to Catholic Radio for Acadiana. This is 90.5 FM and 99.5 FM and 1230 AM. We are your Third Order Dominicans, your lay Dominicans here in Lafayette, Louisiana, based out of Our Lady of Wisdom Church. And this show, every Thursday at 4 p.m., is brought to you by Stein Lumber, with locations throughout all of Acadiana. And we are talking about the very large document of Gaudium et Spes. And in listening to a lot of the commentaries, this has in some ways become kind of like a lightning rod in some, because you have protractors, detractors, interpreters who looked into the document where maybe the document really didn't speak to certain aspects, but it's very clear that the cardinals and those participating in it wanted to address God and the role of God in not only our world and our culture, but they wanted to specifically address the role of the church. And even though some people took, I think, great liberties to, I would say, maybe mistakenly interpret to say certain things like, well, let your conscience be your guide, so on and so forth, and because there's a lot of discussion about your conscience, and that's not what it says. Really, what you need to do, it might be a long read, but I strongly encourage you to read the document, because it really adds a lot of light to what the church's role is in today's society. And it's not to conform to society, but it's to interpret what's taking place and to bring more people to God.
I'm looking at a statement from paragraph 10, where they say, "Nor are there lacking men who despair of any meaning to life." And I really feel like this sense of nihilism has crept in, especially post-quarantine, post-COVID and everything. And I think Gaudium et Spes has a lot to say and respond to that, and to help guide people away from nihilism to see their purpose. And it says that praise and boldness of those who think that human existence is devoid of any inherent significance and strive to confer a total meaning on it by their own ingenuity alone, it just comes up lacking. However, what the answer is, and probably what I think is the crux of this whole document, is what also in paragraph 10, the Church firmly believes that Christ, who died and was raised up for all, can through his Spirit offer man the light and the strength to measure up to his supreme destiny. This reminds me of Father Guillory did a homily recently where he shared that the motto of the, I think it's Carthusian order? Cistercian order was Stat crux dum volvitur orbis. The cross is steady while the world turns. And I think this is what the whole point of this document is, if you really read it, well. Yes.
So what again, as Jeff and Cheryl, you've both alluded to, it's a long document, but it is such an amazing guidepost. And in fact, the document, the Council Fathers, in the form of this document, offers a response to the existential crises of the modern world. And basically, what some have indicated as the sort of key teaching of the document, that is basically an insightful reflection on the dignity of the human person in light of Jesus Christ. And so I'm referring specifically to paragraph 22. And I'll go ahead and recite it now. The truth is that only in the mystery of the incarnate Word does the mystery of man take on light. For Adam, the first man, was a figure of him who was to come, namely Christ the Lord. Christ, the final Adam, by the revelation of the mystery of the Father and his love, fully reveals man to man himself and makes his supreme calling clear. End quote. So basically, Jesus Christ himself reveals man to man. And so whereas atheistic society seeks to find the meaning of life through scientific achievements and discoveries and political power, often gained through violence, the Church holds up Jesus Christ and his humanity as our model and guide.
And you mention, political power, and in, not to jump too far ahead, but in part 2.
Go ahead and jump. We don't have much time.
In part 2, it speaks specifically to the issues of marriage and family, human progress, the economic, social, and political dimensions of what's taking place in the world. And, we mentioned Pope John Paul the second, and it's clear he had a very heavy hand in guiding this part of the document. But it all boils back to an earlier document that we recorded a show on Pope Leo XIII. And he was the author of the encyclical Rerum Novarum. And this was really the beginning of proclaiming Catholic social teaching in the Church and to the world. And a lot of these encyclicals and documents since then, really just build upon what Pope Leo XIII authored. So if you want to learn more about Pope Leo XIII, go ahead and go back and look at and listen to that podcast. But the reoccurring theme in the Church is that there is a place for government. There is a place for forms of government. However, the government and the power and the political power, the money power, should not be concentrated in one person or in a small group of people. And because that just leads to a really destruction of family, of society, of marriage. And this is what the second part of this document talks about, is the dignity of the person, whether it's in married life or in political life, and that dignity has to be taken very seriously in all aspects of our world economy.
And man's dignity actually is based on our obedience to natural law. And within paragraph 16, it says, "For man has in his heart a law written by God. To obey it is the very dignity of man. According to it, he will be judged." So this is addressing not only in this area our dignity, our human dignity, but then, as Jeff's saying in the second part, it is applied to all of mankind, and how we interact with each other.
Yeah, so, basically in paragraph 28, the Council Fathers write in this document, "Respect and love ought to be extended also to those who think or act differently than we do in social, political, and even religious matters." And, end quote. And that's in paragraph 28. We know that today our culture is very much polarized. And as a society, we have sort of forgotten how to even dialogue with one another. I mean, in the past, you could have a philosophical debate and disagree, but then at the end of the debate, you're still friends in the pew. And people on the other side of the political aisle could still sit at the same dinner for table. But now what we see is there's this inability to distinguish between an individual's ideas and their inherent dignity as a person. Okay? And so basically, if your ideas are bad, then therefore you must be a bad person. If I hate your politics, then that means I must hate you. And that is a real problem. And so utilizing the teachings of Gaudium et Spes, the church can aid in the rehabilitation of civility, love, and hope in our culture, although true justice does begin in the human heart, but it's not meant to be confined just there.
And you talk about justice. The document also talks about, going back to the role of the government, and both of you mentioned the dignity and the importance of natural law. It doesn't say that we as Catholics or Christians should just roll over and do nothing, but it does call us to be engaged. Now, it does say, where citizens are oppressed by a public authority overstepping its competence, quoting from Gaudium et Spes, they should not protest against those things which are objectively required for the common good, but it is legitimate for them to defend their own rights and the rights of their fellow citizens against the abuse of this authority, while keeping within those limits drawn by natural law and the Gospels. So, even though the document sounds like it makes clear that there's a fine black line, in reality we know that line is very gray, but keeping those limits drawn by natural law, like what Cheryl was talking about, and the Gospels, that's what's so important in trying to incorporate these values into our society as a whole.
Yeah, and so this sort of then takes us into, because I know we're approaching the end of our segment, but it's important to recognize that no council in history has dedicated more effort and time to the laity than the Second Vatican Council, and so there's an important in fact, it's specifically Part 2, Chapter 1 that speaks to marriage and the family, and so. In fact, I came across some article by a priest who absolutely mandates, as part of marriage formation, that the couple, as part of the their formation before they get married, they are required to read Gaudium et Spes, Part 2, Chapter 1, as a preparation for marriage.
It is an excellent pastoral letter. I mean, you will get a lot personally out of it, and I think even. You'll be surprised at what will challenge you, because I do think it's balanced. Just for an example, it both rejects sort of a communistic or socialistic perspective of government, yes, as well as rejecting a laissez-faire sort of capitalist in economic, growth and everything. So, it's going to challenge everybody on all the spectrum. And like you said, Mike, we need to be able to have that discussion, be in different areas, be challenged by it, listen to it, and walk away with a gospel understanding of what we're supposed to do, not a political understanding of what we're supposed to be doing.
Yeah, and know that we can always turn to Holy Mother Church, right? Ultimately, who is the guardian, as it were, of the deposit of faith, of the truths of our Lord, and as a guide, but we are out there in the trenches, as it were, and so we have to be able to engage in conversation, and this document provides some excellent sort of guidepost to how we can kind of begin to make that happen, and of course always through prayer. Always.
Absolutely. Back to contemplation, and we just touched on this, so hopefully you're interested in going out, looking up Gaudium et Spes and reading that. We'd all recommend it. Remember to stand firm in the absolute truth, Jesus Christ, because only the truth bears grace. God bless.
Lived through time, passed through fire, broke my heart, wounded desire, changed my life, fixed the past, stared at death, and it stared back, standing fast in the light of the word. A shotgun blast was the last thing I heard.